Hi, everyone, and welcome to our November 9th governance workshop. We've got an agenda in the voice chat as usual. And as usual, you can follow along there or not. Well, it's just given a broad outline. So we're going to start with a brief discussion of things that are currently in process. Often we'll have a new KIP AMA. We don't have one today. Today I want to get to a new thing that we're doing in terms of doing retros on prior KIPs that have been passed and executed. And Dietz has graciously agreed to come and lead us through some of that. And then I also, Joe, I didn't talk to you about this yet, but I would love to hear more. We talked in town hall a little bit yesterday about the community feedback about KIP development stuff, but I would love to talk about it some more. So, cool. And then we've got open floor. So with that as the agenda, let's jump right in. So we, as people have hopefully seen, we do have a KIP that's live for voting. Thank you to everyone who is on this call, actually, who has voted so far. And that is ongoing till noon, I believe, tomorrow. So, yeah, that is going well. On the forum, we have a draft KIP for deploying additional ETH. So that is a treasury proposal to just raise the amount. And saw some nice dialogue there between Matt and Joe. So thank you for that. And hopefully we can get that moving. I would like to, I'm assuming Matt's going to talk about this at Treasury Tuesday, next Tuesday, which is probably a more appropriate venue than here. So we'll consider that the AMA for that one. And then we also have a couple of other ones that are currently with the SOFONs. In terms of core documents, these are all in draft, or in terms of the Treasury Charter, they're in voting. So we will certainly, by the next time we meet, we'll have some updated materials there. In terms of governance process, yeah. So we've got another core document coming in terms of truing up KIP 0, as we've discussed extensively in the past. So rather than getting too much into that, I want to go right to Dietz. And this, so the idea behind doing these retros is just sort of taken from what people do already in product and trying to apply that a bit to governance. And I know some other projects do this, of course. We won't be the first. But the idea is just to go back through some, the benefit of hindsight, to go back over some prior decisions we've made collectively and implementations that we've done as a DAO and as labs, and just sort of, retro them and see if there are any lessons we can learn and take forward in the future. So, Dietz, do you want to start with the GMX one, since we've had a lot of discussion about it, and it seems to be a topic that comes up a lot, so it seems like a good place to start.
Yeah, of course. So let me first do my usual little disclaimer caveat here and say that I was not the author of these KIPs, but I was a close observer slash participant in some of the things that we'll be discussing, and especially here first with GMX as well. So looking at KIP 17, which was our proposal to dedicate engineering resources to building a new concept out with GMX called, something that we ended up calling OEV, which was pretty much us building out a way to take the Oracle updates that GMX was getting from Avalanche and Arbitrum based kind of chain link price oracles, and try and help overcome any MEV that was being created as a part of these updates to the oracles that happened in real time, in block time. And so where this came from was a conversation that we started having with GMX, just looking at some of the technical challenges that they were facing with their protocol, and ways that we could work and collaborate with them. So, on the basis of where this came from, I think it was a really productive start, which was how we've handled a lot of our early stage business development conversations, which was us getting in touch with the with the core teams at these other protocols, and us doing what I would consider like a needs assessment on kind of what's happening on the engineering side, on the back end, behind the scenes, that keeps their protocol running. And from those kind of very early preliminary conversations, this concept of OEV or kind of MEV derived from Oracle updates started surfacing. And it then came to this point that we were going to need to decide if we wanted to allocate engineering resources towards this project. So that's kind of the background on KIP 17. What we've seen going forward, I think, has led to, I would say, a little bit of confusion and a little bit of misunderstanding about what the KIP is and kind of what the expectations were on the results of a completed kind of integration with the GMX. And I'll kind of dive into both of those 2 points separately. So what this enabled once this what was passed by the DAO, what was a couple things. The first thing that this enabled was some really great kind of coordinated co-branded marketing that happened between us and GMX, where we got to talk about each other's products a little bit. We got to share that we were going to be collaborating with each other. And it really kind of set up this dedicated conversation between some of the engineers on our team and GMX's team, as well as down the line, involving some of the searchers or keepers that help drive our product forward, kind of looking into the GMX data and trying to build out a solution for them. So I think that from a starting point of this proposal was pretty positive. I really liked seeing the hype that people got from this proposal, but I think that how development is handled and how integrations work it was slightly misunderstood by I would say the broader community, maybe even both communities as well, and kind of what the net result of this integration would be. So, as you can see, this KIP was written back in February, and I believe that it was passed somewhat shortly after that, maybe March time. So if you think about that in the broader scope of where we were as a project, formerly known as KeeperDAO, now Rook, this predates the release of the coordination game, aka the Rook protocol. So pretty much the tech stack that we are currently operating on between the coordinator and the auction mechanism with the green light algorithm and having opportunities bid on by searchers and relaying excess back to users and the rest of the distribution. So that's kind of a key thing to think about, is that while we were agreeing to dedicating resources to this this opportunity, we were still in a place where we were still having high priorities in terms of engineering bandwidth and focus that wasn't this specific integration, as well as a little bit of a lack of defined, let's say, scope and ensuing results of what's going to happen once development has started. So I'm going to kind of pause there. And Jason, can you give me any feedback on kind of what I've walked through now, or if you want me to focus on anything specific?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, this is hugely helpful and really interesting, just as someone who wasn't here during the time. So thank you. And I now understand a lot better this gap that you've identified between expectations and what was actually in the body of the proposal. And yeah, I was wondering if you could say maybe a little bit more about that, because it's something we should think about for the future, right? As we talk about these things, how where can we be clear about scope and where can we be clear about what people can expect? Because I've been around for 6 months, and in that time, people keep talking about this as though this was this really important event. But it sounds like it was an early one of many conversations that have happened on the biz dev side, and maybe not as foundational as its prominence in the conversation would imply.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good place to kind of pick this back up. So what we saw from the kind of co-branded communications and marketing around it, and this new concept that was being developed as this kind of OEV, it led to I would say some confusion as well as a little bit of misunderstanding of kind of how things were going to proceed going forward.
Yeah.
And I think that this was during a time that a lot of our communications around engineering and development were usually kept pretty close to the vest. And that is something that as we've progressed and new technology has been released, as I mentioned, the coordinator and the rest of things that went into the upgraded Rook protocol that was shipped in late April. We've transitioned since, I would say the end of the Q2 report in what was that in June to
Mhm.
kind of this new kind of transparency focused way of communicating and talking about our development that we employed throughout all of quarter three and are employing going forward with the biweekly status updates and things. So I would say that part of that confusion was a little bit of a legacy bug based around how our communications operated back then to how they operate now. But I think that was a little bit minor compared to, uh, I think how the narrative of this, uh, proposal kind of took off without our control as we kind of were less heavy on communications. For GMX and all the power and goodwill to them, they become a very successful operation. They have a ton of users, a ton of volume, a ton of um, great attention socially. So for GMX, they took, I think, from where they were, say, last February to where they are now, they've taken great leaps forward, and I think that is all props to their team and their execution and their product. So fantastic for them. And as people saw GMX grow and the surrounding GMX ecosystem kind of become more valuable and more exciting, the expectation was that you know this uh, this proposal and what was being talked about engineering wise was going to align with that massive growth.
Right.
Um, and I think that that's where the first bit of kind of communication or misunderstanding was that people started to think that we were going to start providing, whether it's an arbitrage service or giving MEV rebates on regular user activity. As GMX saw users and volume numbers grow, they thought, oh, well, this becomes more opportunity for Rook. And that actually is not what the implementation was ever meant to do. GMX was not handing over, say, a front running strategy to their user trades. So that was never actually going to be a part of it. Um,
Mm.
but what did actually come from this was that this was really kind of the birth and very beginning of the transaction relay, aka now Project Starlight, as mentioned in the Q3 report.
Mhm.
And so this gave birth to really kind of fantastic development opportunities for us to build out a more generalized product than just what we were going to be able to address with the agreed upon parameters within GMX. Um, so I think a big lesson learned there is that we needed to continually stay consistent on what it was that we were addressing, integration engineering wise, and that as the narrative slipped beyond our control and outside of what actually was happening, we needed to course correct that a lot sooner, which didn't happen.
Gotcha.
And I think that along the way there were some challenges between the engineering on our side or on the keeper side, or delays in communication that happened between each of our teams as well, that factored into kind of the pace of development for this as well. Um, and I think that things like that happen along software development in general, and it was to be expected. So looking at kind of that on the whole, we see this kind of broader misunderstanding of what is being addressed by the engineering work, as
Mhm.
well as um, I would say inconsistent or lack of communications that happened from our point on kind of where things were and what was happening. Um, we're probably two key lessons to learn from this. Um, so, I think that, as we kind of think about new proposals that factor in work not just on our own products, but collaboration with other DAOs or other engineering groups or anything like that, we've got to understand and communicate clearly that um, timelines become fluid.
Yeah.
Results are not always what I think people jump to conclusions on. Um, and we just need to be consistent on that.
Mhm.
I think that those are kind of three key things that would really kind of help people understand how integration proposals such as this, such as the Gamma one or the M stable one, works.
Mhm.
Is that there are a lot of layers to our operations, and with that we have limited bandwidth and sometimes shifting, but and definitely sometimes higher priorities than some of these. I think as we look at what happened post April, we then started looking at you know this big protocol upgrade that we've been working on, as well as seeing what came from this, which was the birth of kind of this relay product start getting more traction as a more generalized relay or node than just this very specific OEV capturing relay for one specific protocol. I think that all of those were kind of good things for us to kind of look back on now and
Mhm.
understand, okay, well, this is how we can improve this going forward.
Gotcha. Yeah,
Um,
I didn't realize Starlight came out of this. That's phenomenal.
Yeah. So where do we stand now with this? As I mentioned in the Q3 report, this stands as it is still a work in progress. This is not like an abandoned KIP or anything like that. What we're seeing though is that um, functionality wise, our keepers have built kind of a way to figure out and read data and capture in the way that's described, as this coordination facility for GMX around this OEV issue. What
Mhm.
has come from that is that the data is saying that right now it's not necessarily paying off in the way that we thought that with every update there'd be opportunity capture, and that then would get shared between GMX and us. That opportunity has not found its way into consistent profitability while not impacting any of the functionality, whether that's through kind of a slight delay or whatever that might be built into a relay, or just that, if you're looking at this one, Oracle update and nothing happens from it, then, there's nothing to do with that data. If there's no MEV to capture from it, then, um, it just, it's not, capturing anything for either DAO. So where that stands now is that we're still looking at ways of improving this now and kind of finishing it out. But we still have clear priorities in terms of what's happening with engineering as well. On the protocol upgrade side, on the more generalized relay that's being built out as well. Um, so, I think that conclusion, well, not that conclusion, but that bit of understanding about where things were, I think that we probably could have communicated that a little bit sooner, but I think that um, it wasn't. I think that people want to see this as black or white, like it's happening or it's not happening. Well, it's definitely still happening. It's just not the results we're wanting to see from it, and that can be
Yeah.
challenging to communicate because people will think, okay, well, this is a failure, we should give up, and I don't think that's the right answer of how to approach this. I think that us continuing to have dialogue between GMX and us and the keepers is very important to continue.
Yeah, no doubt.
Um,
Cool. Yeah, and also I like looking at the KIP itself. We've added some stuff since the time of this KIP. I mean, everything evolves, right? So like the technology that we've added a lot of stuff in terms of getting more specific about how something will be reported out and who has ownership. And so it sounds like that's a good thing to keep pushing on, just from the
yeah,
mechanics of KIPs themselves.
right. And I think that you kind of could juxtapose this KIP with the TWAM grant, where both of them are smart contract integrations. They
Yeah.
operate completely differently, but so that's not exactly apples to apples. But the TWAM folks, the expectations around it are much different than the GMX ones. GMX ones, I think that and I could be off base here. This is just my own personal maybe speculation, but I think folks were looking for massive boosts, whether that's massive boosts in volume, massive boosts in token prices, or whatever that might be, and that expectation that was created in their own minds, what maybe wasn't met. While the T1 folks, I think what we've seen is great consistent updating from their team and their progress, and we share that progress. If you haven't read any of the TWAM kind of monthly development updates or their big one, big announcement at the end of September saying that they had kind of reached a feature complete product. Very interesting, very technical stuff. Very cool. But the expectations around that are completely different. I think folks understood that that's a project being built from scratch and that it's going to take time and that no news doesn't equal bad news on that front.
Mhm.
And so I think uh, expectations alignment really needs to be kind of understood as things are being written out and communicated.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And clearly this is something you're moving toward already with these quarterly reports and the biweekly sessions. So that makes a lot of sense. That's great. All right, thank you. Do you, do you mind talking about the buybacks? Unless anybody has any questions.
I would just add one last thing
Please.
on this topic, which was um, I liked that our community wanted to hold us, I would say, accountable. They wanted to know what was happening here. And I think that us maybe shying away from sharing some of that information uh, was tactically incorrect.
Gotcha.
And I think that, you know, I like to see folks ask us what's happening and what's going on with stuff. Yeah, I think it's important for people to show interest in what's being built and want to understand it more. So I would continue to encourage that. I wouldn't say that their kind of persistence was a negative in the slightest bit at all. And I think that we should appreciate that.
Hmm. Absolutely.
But looking at KIP 13, um,
Yeah.
which was one of our buybacks. I think this is another interesting one, and yet again, uh, caveat here: um, I was not the author of this kip. I wasn't a part of the execution of what happened here, but very interesting to look at a kip that uses treasury funds to acquire X. In this case, it was acquiring Rook, and what happens with that as well. So I'm happy to dig into this as well.
Yeah, please. That would be great.
Yeah. So what we've seen historically through our kind of time in governance and how the DAO operates um, is that from time to time our treasury is needed to acquire assets. And what we found through that time is that there's been challenges in doing that in a way that one fulfills the requirements of the proposal and how it's written, and two, um, getting through the technical challenges of the operations based side of things, whether that's making moves as a multi sig or telegraphing our moves on proposals. Um, and so, I think that this KIP had some lessons learned from previous acquisition KIPs on how things could be acquired and what strategies we could use. And also, what is the objective of the acquisition? Um, I think that looking at this buyback that was done, um, what we saw was another misalignment of expectations. I think that folks, especially, in late 2021, um, they wanted to see massive price action as a result of this kit passing, was some of the expectation around that. Um, that is not always in the best interest of our acquisition strategy. Because if you think of massive price impact while you're trying to acquire something, what does that do? Well, it either A, increases your cost, or if your cost is capped, you're going to acquire less. And so, what needed to be done was how can we acquire as much as possible while doing so in a way that doesn't impact the market? And our objective was to get as much Rook as possible based off of a maximum budget. And so that those kind of objections or objectives um, sometimes fall a little bit out of line with some other people's expectations. And so I think again, this goes back to really working through and clearly understanding uh, expectations and objectives of KIPs, as well as understanding how things are going to be completed.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's also, I mean, hearing you say that, it is remarkable how the this KIP is pretty clear, I think, in terms of the strategic objectives.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I could imagine in that environment of January, people kind of looked past that and seemed to have focused on, when will the token go up?
Right.
That's got to be difficult. But I think that I don't know. As someone looking at this from the outside, the proposal seems pretty clear. So in retrospect, how would you see addressing, trying to avoid that kind of divergence?
Can you rephrase that? Sorry.
I didn't say that well. I mean, so like you talked about mismanagement of expectations, but I think that the KIP itself was really clear. So if there were expectations, they were coming from something else. So how, yeah, how could we manage those expectations? Like if we were to do a buyback for similar reasons today?
Yeah, I think that clearly talking through stuff as we have now a really solid system is a great way to begin to work through that.
Yeah.
I also think that as our DAO has progressed and aged, we've seen less of the speculation
Yeah.
conversation happen and
Yep.
more of the build and sustain conversation take the forefront here. So I think that and I would hate to generalize that comment, but I think that looking across DAOs that over the last 18 months, I think that you've seen the speculator DAOs have their rise and fall, and I think a lot of that energy has kind of gone from a lot of this DAO work that's happening right now. So I would say that possibly there is not as much of that energy that's around these days if we were to talk about another buyback or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but I think that we need to look at buybacks through a lens of just understanding what we're accomplishing, and that it's going to be accomplished in a way that is going to be in the best interest of the DAO, and maybe not for the individual. Um, at least that would be how I would perceive that. Um,
Yep.
I don't know if I have a perfect solution to how we would handle a next buyback conversation, but I do know that we've had a relatively solid bit of success of just talking through things of late. I think looking at um, our last kind of contentious proposal, um, I would say that um, we've as a DAO have learned to really kind of come together in much more kind of organized and I hate to categorize it this way, but like a much more adult way of talking about these kinds of topics as well, where folks aren't just kind of shouting at each other about their opinion is the only thing they're willing to hear.
Yeah.
So so I think that that's kind of improved along the way. Um, I could see the benefit of us bringing up this conversation again as we look ahead to kind of what happens, in the future. Uh,
Mhm.
but I wouldn't shy away from this at all. I think that we're in a place governance wise, we're in a place, uh, I wouldn't say expectation wise, but at least operationally of how we'd go about executing on proposals in a way that I think that we would have enough trust built up that we would accomplish what we'd set out to do. Because I think we've learned enough lessons in our asset acquisition proposals of how to handle things as a DAO with its limitations properly.
Yeah. That is reassuring. I don't think there's been a buyback one since this one, has there?
You know, is very specifically about that, no. But if you look at the discretional budget or
Mhm.
discretionary budget
That's,
proposal, I think that was
yeah.
what 20 something. I'm sorry, I apologize for not knowing the right one off the top of my head.
23. 23.
23, thank you.
Yeah.
That ended up being used to acquire Rook.
Sure.
So there is many ways for our DAO to acquire or handle the token. Uh,
Mhm.
and whether that be through very specific means like KIP 13, um, other specific ways, like if you look at KIP 4, I believe, one of the first KIPs, which was using specific revenues to buy back and burn tokens. That was pre-coordination game, but
Yeah.
that was one way to look at it. The discretionary budget is another way to look at it. Um, Something that didn't happen through governance, but was used through approved budget means was the boost program that we used um, revenue
Yeah.
from the CVX proposal to kind of handle the Rook token as well. So I think that there are many ways to approach acquiring and distributing or whatever the assets between the DAO.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think I'd be curious about your thoughts on this. It seems like the coming into this after these original kips that were about buybacks and burns, like it struck me that that's a very different kind of conversation to have than here's something we're going to do for discretionary purposes, or here's something we're going to do for strategic purposes, like the uh, I lost my train of thought. The last one you talked about,
Right.
the
Yes.
trial. Yeah,
Through KIP 5.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, I think there's also a little bit of education that comes into play here. And I will again preface this with I'm not a lawyer. I do not know the right uh, regulatory parameters, but that also needs to be a consideration, which, for me, not as not the author of the proposals or the executor of most of them and how things went around or went
mhm,
about. Um, I I think that if we were to bring this conversation up, I think that we do need to look at kind of what's been happening in the space. I mean, even in the last kind of month, where you have different DAOs that are coming under more regulatory scrutiny. And I think that some of that is based off of the products that they offer, which are not products that we offer, leverage and things like that.
yeah,
But I think that as you look at, what's a part of our DAO, which is the Rook token, I think that you just need to um, kind of have a larger time horizon and a larger regulatory scope where I mean, even if there's a lack of regulatory clarity, that doesn't need to stop certain entities from looking back in time and coming after you. At least in what I feel like I'm seeing here. So
yeah,
so that would be one thing of like, if this conversation were to come back up, I would just like us to make sure that that's something that's thought about and discussed before actions are taken.
yeah. In terms of another buyback, you mean?
Yeah, or how things like revenue are handled.
Yeah,
Um, I think there are a lot of great ideas out there, and I wouldn't be the right one to say that we should go with one idea over the other. I think there's some stuff that seem exciting. There's some things that seem boring, but maybe the boring one provides us more regulatory safety than an exciting opportunity. So you know what, it's not my expertise, but I would that would be, if I saw a proposal, that would be one of the things that I'd think about personally, was just like, okay,
mhm,
well, how does this fit in the landscape these days?
yeah. It's so different, the regulatory landscape. That's great.
You know, I think that, I mean, as we think about buybacks, I think that that's become a topic based off of the tokenomic streamlining proposal that's coming up.
Yeah.
That's being discussed right now. And for me personally, I, I I see that as two separate things. Personally, that's my opinion. But
Mhm.
I think breaking those off into two separate things creates the ask of trust onto the project to kind of look at what happens next and handle what happens next properly. And for some people that's too much of an ask, for them to place complete kind of trust in what happens next without it being defined yet. Um, so I understand that maybe those conversations can happen concurrently, but I would then again just make sure that we've checked all of our bases and are doing the right thing for the DAO. Excuse me.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like the hurdle for what requires legal reviews has certainly shifted, among other things.
Right. But I would say that for folks that is their primary concern, I would like to see much more than just digging your heels in the ground of taking action. If that's what you really want to see as a part of it, well, this is a DAO. Let's start writing it up and let's start discussing. But I think folks using kind of binary options of like go, no go, or if this isn't included, it's not a worthwhile proposal. I don't see that as a right way to approach this personally. I can see conversations happening at the same time that will allow for one thing to move forward while still working through the second thing. And that's my personal opinion, and I'm not a SOFON, so I don't make some of these calls. But that's where me as, a contributor that's working, I I like and love seeing the development that's happening. And I think that our future's extremely bright, and some of the changes being proposed only add to kind of the power of that brightness. Um, and as someone that has invested way too much of their own personal assets into and time into what's happening here, um, I only want to see the success of this protocol. I'm not looking for some kind of mechanism to exit. That's not what I'm here for. I'm here to see us succeed. And so I think that that's me asking for trust. But that's just based off of what I'm doing. I'm not the sole driver of this protocol in the slightest bit.
Well, yeah, thank you for all that. I think it's a great place to stop and open it up to comments or questions. And welcome, Dan and Rizo. All right. Well, that was a phenomenal first go at retros. That was so much more interesting and productive than I even expected it to be. So thank you, Dietz. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. And as you know, I feel like I'm the old horse in the stable. Uh,
Yeah.
so I'm happy to kind of continue to work through a lot of these and talk through them, and for us to continue to improve and get better. Um, but I think this is a fantastic opportunity that you've created for us to kind of look in the mirror a little bit and figure out kind of what happens next.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I've already learned so much, and I think it'll be really helpful to the DAO that we can start, with these star-based summaries, we can start posting them to the KIPs themselves, so we can start sort of closing these circles and making sure that we're all learning from this, which will be great. Um, all right, Joe, how's well, uh, It sounds like, Joe, you're having a really bad telecommunications day.
It's been a really bad week, actually, and not going to get here to fix it on Friday. Hopefully, this is a decent intermediary between now and then.
Well, you sound pretty clear. So, can you, if your connection works for you and if the timing works for you, can you tell us a little bit about some of the stuff that came up yesterday in town hall? You've been doing some really cool work with community feedback, and would love to hear more about that as it relates to KIPS and to governance in general, and how we can do better with the community.
Absolutely. I had aggregated as much feedback as I could from the rest of the existing community areas that the person in my position previously had left behind as possible, and anything else that I had been able to gather in my short time here so far, and the other sorts of pieces left around on the forums. I'm still kind of digging through and expanding this knowledge as I go, but I'm sifting for themes and action items that come through in all of these different places of feedback, and really doing a deep analysis of what the complaints are, what the compliments are, and where the action items lie that may address the underlying causes of those things along the way, because they're kind of intangible or otherwise not prioritized because they're not visible. And one of the things that came up was a central point of failure for the development and the editing of KIPs. At this stage, the process for quality control and the submission that we are improving with things like this retrospective, we are able to expand the usefulness and the targeting effectiveness of KIPs that come out. And so one of the things that the governance workshop as a call specifically can do is to create a targeted KIP development time frame. So in a case like the current Rook DAO Treasury Charter voting period, it would be, or even before that, the forums. So that would be streamlining tokenomics, staking ALCX, and deploying ETH. If we had a 20-minute segment during this call that was dedicated to, as a group, reading through the draft as it existed at that state, and then discussing it amongst ourselves and coming up with a more coordinated feedback stream that we could then deliver as a group at the end of the call, could create a massive engagement point for these forums and ensuring that the community has the buy-in we need to know that we are actually aligned. But then it gives the individual participants the exposure to it on a repeated basis in such a way that it allows them to become governance experts without having to really study too much outside of the book. But to improve the native understanding of what goes into a good KIP, it would also benefit to have a segment or workshop that is designed to propagate education around that KIP editing. So that means teaching explicitly the formats that we expect as a DAO, teaching the content focal points that we want to see checked off, because these are the things that the community wants to consider in order to make a well-informed decision in the voting booth. And this governance workshop is the perfect environment from which we can tap that level of feedback and education most effectively, I believe.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it sounds like there's two, like feedback comes from the community and the education would come from, yes, those of us who are me who's editing, right? Like that.
Yeah, I imagine that at some point in Rook DAO's environment of existence, there is somebody whose dedicated sole responsibility is maintaining the KIP process. And this person will then be educating the community so that they can engage and create their own KIPs and really develop from the community level the evolution of what our DAO does.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, yeah, I'm just, that's really interesting. I think one of the things we need to do to get there is we've got stuff that is in KIP stage that maybe needs to move just into documentation stage. And we've talked about this before in terms of how to write a KIP, right? Like that's kind of missing right now. That seems like a necessary first condition before. And I'm also wondering maybe if people would be willing to look at a before, if someone sends, like Matt, I work with a lot, or Daddy Matty, I work with a lot, for example. So maybe we could walk through a before and after edited one. That could also be helpful.
I think that would be excellent. And we can take these retrospectives and pull the sort of siftings of knowledge from that and continually add to the educational process and really snowball the effectiveness of our governance based off of a constant feedback loop, because the frequency of that feedback latency allows us to become a quick reacting DAO.
Mm-hmm. Good. I like that. We'll keep. Yeah. So what else did people say? Like what else are you finding from the surveys?
Oh man, there is tons. If I were to go into some of the themes, um, KIP feedback pre-vote is one of the early ones. Roadmap resolution increases. So the idea that timelines for release may be somewhat nebulous, but having a more concrete idea of all of the items on that timeline and really giving a vision of that 5-year plan for Rook DAO is something that there is an appetite for. There was a very small sample size on this so far, so none of this is authoritative. The more feedback I get, the better these answers are going to be. But the priorities, it seemed to be signaling a desire towards research, education, and community-based grants. So that indicates a little bit about the way that spending is desired to be prioritized. And then the measures of success feedback has been so widely distributed as to say it's equal across the board in categories such as revenue, engagement, brand, integrations, and yield. So the ideas of exactly how we measure our success as a DAO is not well understood. I think refinement there is something that a community activity would yield a lot of growth with. There are 2 perceived threats that stuck out from the feedback so far that are larger than the others, and that is sell pressure and overspending of the treasury. The following threats that were trailing equally behind that were regulation, retention, and volume. So there's a definite priority in the threats that are perceived for the DAO at this stage, and you can kind of infer based off of sell pressure and overspending that retention is somewhat higher on the worry list by the symptoms there. That's my inference anyway.
Just to ask, when you say retention of what?
That would be retention of talent. So the intangibles, that's you, me, Dietz, Hazard, the keepers, all the brains that really make Rook Rook.
Gotcha.
And yeah, so then there is a clear, strong theme of community objectives as platform support, education, awareness cultivation, and coordination with other ecosystem participants / integration into the tech stack. You know, the idea that we entrench ourselves in the protocol layering and money Legos. The onboarding and support and awareness were the biggest leaders, but onboarding and support had probably a 30 to 40% lead over everything else. And outside of those three, the other categories were crowdsource contribution, retention, and MEV rethink as themes that I had kind of sifted out from recurring mentions. And that's how I ranked the level of concern there, was frequency of mention.
It's really interesting. All right, great. Well, I look forward to hearing more about how this evolves. I mean, it sounds like this is ongoing, right? Like you're continually polling people?
Absolutely, and I cannot beg hard enough for responses from everybody involved and not involved. I want everyone answering this survey because right now my sample size is 2. And there is a lovely and very nice POAP that was designed specifically for those who respond to the survey that I give out. So those who choose to do so may get a unique piece of artwork that I personally really enjoy. And so if you want to get a look at that artwork, fill out the survey. With that, yeah, I will link it in the calls channel. And otherwise, I look forward to reading the responses and giving better feedback with each one that comes in. And I'm always looking to expand the questions to make it more relevant to the community and really keep it as an evolving document. So the resource always remains agile, fresh, and capable of delivering us a value beyond what is typically seen because it's well analyzed.
Sure. Good. Well, that I think we are at time, and I think that's a perfect place to stop. Unless I'll open it up to any last comments or questions. All right. Well, thank you, Dietz. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Dan, for coming. Thank you, Trade-In, for the upcoming, typically excellent summary. And yeah, I think we'll close out. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Jason.